Two. Hello. Hello. What's up? What's up, folks? What's up, friends? How are you? How are you doing? How are you doing? I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. Thank you for inquiring. Boy, that last stream was certainly something else, huh? There was certainly some stuff that happened in that previous stream, which we don't need to get into the details of. Needless to say, I thought, given that it's the internet and it's, live streaming, I thought the stream elements text-to-speech function would have some kind of like automated moderator settings just clicked on right off the bat. Just right as soon as you turn it on. I found out the hard way that you do have to manually go in there and activate those automated mod settings. I don't know why we're still doing this here in the year 2023. We can't trust people with text-to-speech functions on live streams without having some moderation settings just automatically ready to go. So that was unpleasant. I got a little bit heated yesterday. If you're used to seeing my calm demeanor, I got a little hot under the collar yesterday. But I'm back. Here I am. The weird racist trolls can't stop me from coming on here to share my viewpoint. If I didn't, then the racist trolls would win. You totally ruined the dinner party. That was such a wonderful vibe, and it was just ruined. It was immediately ruined, folks. I've got a fantastic lunch situation going on here. By the way, I just turned off all my stream elements alerts or anything like that. So if anyone does use the tip function today, I will make sure to manually play your alert. I will make sure to manually play your alert if anyone feels like donating using the tip function today. But I'm going to go ahead and keep those on mute for the next little while. If you don't mind. Anyway, I got a really good lunch situation going on right now, folks. I've been planning on doing a special noodle concoction for you in the chat the last couple of days. I've never managed to get the timing right, but today I did. I haven't eaten anything today other than I had a Jolly Rancher sucker. Or Sousson, it's called in French. Is it a sucker? I guess. I ordered some marijuana products from totally legally ordered some marijuana products, which were sent to me, and they included a little Jolly Rancher sucker in there, which was quite enjoyable actually. But that's all I've had to eat. So what I did today was, and I actually got, because I've been eating so much ramen and instant noodles, because I've embraced the instant noodle lifestyle, I actually got some new bowls as well. I got some actual noodle bowls and fancy chopsticks now, because I'm really starting to take this shit seriously. So I'm going to show you this. So what I made, if you're in the Discord server, I showed you, I picked these up the other day. There's this Japanese grocery store near where I live that I hadn't really checked out before. And I went the other day and it's fantastic. They've got everything. They've got all the crazy ramen brands and all the different spices and sauces that you need to make kind of decent sort of food with. And so I picked up the Buldak, the 4 cheesy ramen, cheesy, spicy, hot chicken ramen. So I picked that up, and so I made that for lunch today. I added some smoked sausage and some extra mozzarella cheese, melted some more mozzarella cheese into that. So I have right next to me my cheesy ramen, cheesy, spicy, hot chicken ramen with added mozzarella and smoked sausage chunks and chili crisp and green onion. Check this out. Are you ready for this? Here's my new bowl. And like there, look, there we go. So I'm really looking forward to eating this. Wearing a white shirt to eat this was just stupid. It was just stupid. I might put on a hoodie, actually. I think that's probably a good idea, frankly. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to put on my black hoodie while I eat these. One sec. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Chup the cheesy ramen.
Who is that now? I'm like stressed out about alerts. Old Dutch, thank you so much. The 26 months. Resub at tier 2 and for all everything you do for the community, Old Dutch, thank you. I'm not gonna chup this cheesy ramen because it does come with like a spicy sauce. It does come with like a darker spicy sauce, so I think that's gonna act as the chup in this case. Okay. I'm going to make peanut noodles for lunch. You've inspired me. I love influencing people to join the noodle lifestyle. So I don't have a ton of time for the chit chat today because I've got Kala Walsh coming on in an hour and I've got a few things that I want to get to before then. Any opinions on stainless steel chopsticks? I thought about getting some. I hope they last longer. I've never tried. I don't think I've ever tried to use. What's everyone else having for lunch today? Why don't you fill me in? Fill me in on that. And they're so gooey and cheesy and spicy smelling. Oh my god! Like, look at this. Oh my goodness. Oh my. That's so good. That is so good. That's like unbelievably good. Man. Oh my. This is really something else. I think I was expecting this to be good, but I think this has surpassed my expectations here. My goodness. Oh, what's everyone else having for lunch today? This is like really something else. I'm going into like a ramen fugue state right now. Chin chin. If I just knocked those on the floor just now, I would have cried. Just did a bacon sandwich. That's nice. There's a couple things that I wanted to look at before Hollow Walsh comes on in an hour. There's a couple things that I want to show you here. Number one is I made this TikTok today that I want to show you in response to a Noam Chomsky video. That's this TikTok account called Commie Trash was sharing. And I was talking yesterday about how, you know, there is like a lot of like left-wing content on TikTok, but I think I saw a video this morning that enraged me because it showed the level of like thought and the level of like analysis that's going into the most popular socialist kind of TikTok users. I'm going to show this to you right now. I don't have time to be messing around here. Let me see.
There hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet.
It was with Commie Trash. I'm going to find the original video. I'll show you this channel, first of all. I had to go off here on old Noam. And whatever, like, person in their 20s is operating this account. Commie Trash on TikTok. 258,000 followers. Here's a big red flag, but that I didn't realize before. Libertarian socialism. Libertarian socialism in the bio. So that's red flag number one here. So let me see if I can find the video I was responding to. I had to like do this complicated process to stitch. So I kind of lost the original video that I wanted to respond to. Is this video,
There hasn't been a shred of
the
socialism
USSR, why the
Now, of course,
Soviet
they call it
Union was
socialism.
not socialist, featuring Noam Chomsky. Okay. So this is the original video. This ruined my whole morning. This ruined my whole morning because like I saw this at like 10 a.m. and then it's like, no, I have to respond to this. Oh, nice, Sasha. I'm glad you got this shirt. Which one did you get? Happy to hear that. We've got some great merch. We got more merch coming too as well. We were talking about some really cool merch stuff a couple weeks ago, and then the people that actually make the merch very generously have actual jobs and responsibilities, which I think is bullshit, but you know, it's nothing really I can do. But we should have more merch coming eventually. So I saw this video at like 10 a.m. and then I was like, okay, well, I have to do a response. But then it's really hard to like edit on my phone. So I've got to like, I do the response and then I export the video and then I export it onto my PC and then I do my little edits and then I put it back in my phone and then I'm it took my whole fucking morning to do this simple response to it. But here's this original clip from Noam. I'll show you the original clip. And then this is the problem with like Western socialism and the attitude that they have towards like the USSR. In which they follow Noam's lead here. Noam, who was staunchly against the USSR. We're going to get into all that, though. Here's the original clip, though. And again, I was just depressed. Like, this is like 40,000 views on TikTok coming from this account, Commie Trash. The Commie Trash account sharing this Noam Chomsky clip about why the USSR was not socialism. Like, this really like... It kind of encapsulates all the problems with this kind of like chauvinistic Western viewpoint on this, and like what's this utopian idea of socialism, what it is and isn't. I reread Black Shirts and Reds over the weekend. I absolutely love how often Parenti shits on Chomsky. Me too, and this is why I will always uphold Parenti, and while I will always agree with the Chad Parenti versus Virgin Chomsky analysis. Anyway, let's look at this, okay? Here's Noam Chomsky coming from TikTok account commie trash about why the USSR is not socialist. Here it is. Try to watch this without getting enraged. First person to get angry loses, okay?
There hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. You know, they were people's democracies, the purest form of democracy. They were socialism. The left, the West, the big propaganda system in the world, of course, just laughed at the democracy part, but it loved the socialism part, because that's a way to defame socialism. So if you think that the fall of the Soviet Union is a blow to socialism, you ought to also think on the same grounds that it's a blow to democracy. After all, they call themselves democracies too, so why isn't it a blow to democracy? It makes as much sense. It's only when it gets filtered through the Western propaganda system that it's not a blow to democracy, but it is a blow to socialism. But, you know, there's absolutely no reason to play that game. What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It's not has nothing to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. You know, they didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished, and they knew it. You know, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got grips of things, after he said, he moved to what he called state capitalism, which is what it was. It had nothing to do with socialism. Socialism, I mean, you can argue about there's no point arguing what the word means, but what it always meant at the core was that producers take control of production. You know, working people take control of production, what's sometimes called industrial democracy. That was the absolute core of it. Well, you know, there was more socialism in Germany, in Western Europe, than there was in Russia. You know, Russia's about the most anti-socialist place you can imagine since 1918. Had wage labor, had super exploitation, had no element of workers' control or involvement or participation. Well, that's pure, you know, what's it got to do with socialism? It's the exact opposite on every point. As I say, the West liked to call that socialism while laughing at the fact that they called themselves Democrats. But that's for purely propaganda reasons. I mean, unless you're committed to being part of the Western propaganda system, there's nothing to say about that issue of dissent except to laugh.
Yeah, unless you're part of the Western propaganda system, says Noam Chomsky, while he's like denigrating the number one enemy of Western imperialism. Of course, Noam would never be propagandized. Noam is immune to propaganda, and so are democratic socialists, like this account, Commie Trash, and other people that subscribe to these views. So I saw that, I was like, I have to put a response to this. This is so fucking annoying. I can't believe people like are still debating this kind of shit here, like this in 2023. We're still doing this. So here I try. I don't know if it'll have the same impact, but I did do a little response to this. Here it is. And this is what I spent my whole fucking morning doing now, because this ruined my morning.
There hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Noam Chomsky's done a lot of work that I think is very valuable, but this is unfortunately another common Noam L, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, this whole idea that the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, I think is very silly on its face. I mean, maybe it makes sense if your understanding of socialism is just the workers owning the means of production, and not a process of struggle that the Soviet Union was indeed engaged in. A struggle to build that kind of system, to build that kind of classless, stateless society. But there was a lot of obstacles to building that system. They were under threat from moment one from Western imperialism because they represented a threat to the hegemony of these colonialist powers and their financial interests. They were also under this growing fascist threat coming from Germany, which culminated in a war that killed 29 million people in the Soviet Union. That war would have gone the other way were it not for that incredible sacrifice. And despite all these massive obstacles, they still did in the Soviet Union raise living standards for millions of people. They overthrew this czarist system. They overthrew feudalism. All of a sudden, millions of people had access to healthcare and literacy, education, and basic social services. These things just didn't exist prior to the existence of the Soviet Union. That's an incredible accomplishment, and yes, it is democratic considering the fact that for these millions of people who had access to all these benefits of this socialist process, they didn't have democracy prior to that. In the czarist system, it was a huge improvement for millions and millions of people, an improvement in their lives. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Noam Chomsky celebrated, living standards for these millions of people just dropped off a fucking cliff. Suicide rate shot up, alcoholism and drug addiction, sex trafficking, life expectancy, access to education and healthcare, all these things just plummeted. It was a massive human rights disaster for millions of people in Russia and elsewhere in these former Soviet republics. So yes, the Soviet Union was engaged in building socialism. And were there mistakes that happened? Were there contradictions? Sure there were. But I think if you live in the West, if you live in the heart of the empire, then you should stand in solidarity with people around the world, wherever they are, that are trying to build something, that are engaged in this struggle, and not do whatever the hell Noam was doing in this clip. Also, Noam, why did you meet with Jeffrey Epstein? That's super weird, dude.
There hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. We got him. Canadian stoner annihilates anarcho-libertarian academic counter-revolutionary. That's what one would call a banger. Thank you, post-capitalist desire. Thank you for that. I doubt the CIA cuts him checks. He just does their work for free. Well, that's the whole thing. It's like, I don't think Noam's on the CIA payroll, but there's a reason that Noam becomes this prominent academic, because he has this kind of analysis that ultimately is not a threat. He criticizes Western imperialism. Excuse me. Sorry, folks. He criticizes Western imperialism. He criticizes the horrors of what the United States government does. But at the same time, he refuses to like take a strong stance in support of their greatest fucking rival, the people that are trying to take their power away, the people that are lending support to these big anti-colonial struggles all over the world, in Vietnam and Korea and all these other places. And so that's the thing, is I don't think Noam is like still collecting like sacks of cash from the CIA or anything like that, but there's a reason that Noam rises to this position of being this prominent, respected academic, and other people that have different analyses, who do uphold the Soviet Union correctly, like Michael Parenti, don't get nearly the same level of like cultural saturation and respect and admiration and influence. It's literally the thing. That's the irony. It's literally the thing that Noam told the British reporter. That's the funny thing, is that Noam and his like fans can't make that same. They can't like make that same argument. They can't understand the same, like the way that works, the way that access works, and the way that, yeah, if Noam believed any different, he wouldn't be sitting where he's sitting. You know what I mean? Just like the journalist that Noam was talking to, and he correctly pointed this out. And I will always point to this as being a really important moment to help us understand how this kind of propaganda model works. But it's the same thing with Noam. If he believed anything different, he wouldn't be given those lectures. He wouldn't be given that level of access and support, and he wouldn't be put in that position. Anyway, that's why I thought it was important to do that little response. I'm tired of like that being the analysis that's out there about the Soviet Union or socialism or whatever else. I want to try and like, sorry, there's street cleaning right outside the window. Very distracting. Yeah, Squatch Drew. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear about your precious third pick, okay? I'm trying to do serious discussion here, Squatch Drew, not this like, sports ball. Oh, I'm trying to talk about important historical materialist analyses here. I don't have time for this like sports stuff. Chomsky has said he prefers workers' councils and workplace democracy to a strong centralized party, which in his view obtained in the USSR. Feel free to disagree with him. This limited hangout stuff is silly. Well, I do disagree. And I think it's when you're using your position as this foremost leftist academic to deny the very idea that people in the USSR were engaged in this process of building socialism, whether you mean to or not, you are doing the work of the imperialists that you claim to be against. And that's the whole point about these like workers' councils and workplace democracy. The Soviet Union would not exist if after the Russian Revolution they had said, well, we won. We're just going to hand over, we're going to abolish the state. We're going to hand over all the means of production to these workers' councils. And we're just going to go home. We're finished. We won. They would have been immediately destroyed. Immediately. They certainly wouldn't have been able to develop the industrial capacity that they needed to in order to defend themselves from the fascist onslaught. They needed to have that strong centralized party or else it wouldn't exist. There would be no, like, not only would there not be socialism, there would be fucking nothing. There would be go back to feudalism, or they would become this like backwater colony of Western imperialism. And that's what I mean by that idea of socialism. It's not just this, you have a socialist revolution and it becomes immediately perfect overnight, like what Noam and his fans want. You just press the socialism button and you're socialism, and then you just go home afterwards. You know, it's a long process, a years or decades long or even centuries long process of establishing that kind of system, of establishing that classless, stateless society. And if they had just done this, they had attempted, just similar to China in the 70s, in the Mao period, or like, you know, the end of the Mao period, you know, China, like from the formation of the PRC, it's the same kind of thing. If they had just abolished their state overnight and tried to just have socialism, despite all these massive problems, despite the widespread poverty and illiteracy, well, guess what? There would not be a PRC to this day. This is not how it works. It's this long process that is unique to each different culture that tries to engage in this process. And thank you, Dimitri, for the 100 friend coin. He said, we can defeat our capitalists, we can build socialism, and we can make it happen, but that does not mean that we can guarantee the country of the dictatorship of the proletariat against the dangers from outside, against the dangers of intervention and the associated restoration of the old orders. We don't live on an island, we live in a capitalist environment. Joey Steele. He had it right. I'm sorry. Yeah, how many assassination attempts did Castro survive already? Like they had to do these things. They were under threat from moment one. And also, not only, as I talked about in this video, did they raise living standards for millions of people, but they turned Russia and they turned the USSR into this industrial powerhouse in like a span of a few decades. This is a process that took centuries, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. It took a very long time. They managed to do this in a few decades. And that's a victory for socialism. And yes, they were engaged in that process. Again, it's not a thing that just happened. It's not just workers controlling the means of production that you institute overnight. It's a process. It's a struggle. It's a long struggle. It's a lifetime of struggle. And that's why I need to like make these fucking videos so more people on TikTok don't get twisted on this. And think that start accepting this idea that anyone that tries to actually engage in this process of building socialism say, oh, they're doing it wrong. They're state capitalist. They use markets. You know, whatever. There's billionaires or whatever the argument is. Like people have to start getting this idea out of their minds and understanding the idea of socialism as being a struggle, a process, a long process, a lengthy struggle. There's a good breakthrough news clip with Carlos Martinez. We could watch this. It's 15 minutes. Well, we got Kala Walsh in 40. I did want to talk about the Elon interview as well, but it's coming on at 2. Maybe I can time for that after. Let's take a look at this. But yes, the USSR was socialist, and so is China. So is China. Oh, and by the way, on that, while we're talking about breakthrough news and China, this is actually really exciting. I heard from our friend Radio Free Amanda yesterday, because Ken Hammond, who is often appearing on Breakthrough News to talk about China, who has a really great analysis of China and talks about this often, and I think has really helped inform us in terms of these historical trends and this understanding the importance of standing in solidarity with China and their socialist project. Ken Hammond, he's putting out a new book called China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. I was very fortunate. I think I'm going to be getting sent a copy of that, which I'm really looking forward to. We were talking maybe about doing something in the Discord with that, with the book club or something. We'll see how that works. But I also inquired about getting Ken Hammond to come on this stream to talk about this stuff. And Amanda did say that we can set up an interview with him. So I am hoping in the next couple of weeks we can have Ken Hammond on, author of the book China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. Come on to talk to us about this stuff. It comes up all the time. It's one of the main things that we talk about on the show. So I think it would be really fantastic to have him come on to break some of these concepts down for us. I guess this should have been the title of this segment all along. By the way, that cheesy ramen that I made was, I want to say like one of the best things I've ever eaten. Like, it's honestly like, I don't know if I'm being hyperbolic. It was really, really good though. Like, I really enjoyed it. Like, I'm kind of blown away by how good it was. And with the smoked sausage and the onion in there and the chili crisp, holy Lord, was fucking mind blowing. Anyway, let's look at this clip. Okay. And again, we got Kala Walsh coming on at 2 p.m.
May 9th was Victory Day, which is celebrated around the world for the victory of the Allied forces against Nazi Germany in World War II. And certainly the Soviet Union was certainly the principal fighter there in that conflict and played the principal role in terms of bearing the brunt and fighting the Nazi war machine. So brought many of those issues back into focus here. And to talk more about all of this, we are very happy to be joined here on the show by Carlos Martinez, who's an author and activist and the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Carlos, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey guys, good afternoon. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. And of course, I will just plug this here, The End of the Beginning, about the history of the Soviet Union there, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse by Carlos Martinez. You can get that here in the U.S. at 1804books.com. But, very important issue because, you raised this in the beginning of your book that the Soviet Union has many world historic achievements to its name, one of which being the Soviet legacy in World War II. And I was hoping we could just start there because especially here in the United States, this is a completely untold story. All we hear about is D-Day, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you look at the map of Europe in 1942, right, you've got practically the whole of continental Europe.
I did see that old Dutch. I would like to watch that.
It's occupied by the Nazis or it's occupied by Nazi allies. Britain, where I am, was saved only by, the helpful existence of the English Channel. And it was the Soviet Union principally working with the partisan movements in Europe that defeated the Nazis. We don't talk about that. It's not fashionable to talk about that. It's not even, in high school history curriculums, that's not taught. In Britain, we seem to think World War II was won by a slightly chaotic evacuation of Dunkirk. In the US, you think that it was the Americans getting involved at the last minute, rushing troops to Western Europe to prevent France and Italy from going communist, that was some kind of crucial determining factor in the war. Of course it wasn't. It was the heroism of the Soviet Union, which lost 27 million people in the struggle to defeat fascism. And, I think it's worth saying on this program that victory was a victory for the socialist system, not just, a massive country. It wasn't just a victory for people's kind of patriotism and nationalist feeling. It was a victory for socialism, for rapid...
And again, I want to point out as well, if the munitions factories that were manufacturing under this like incredibly fucking advanced timeline, manufacturing like the means that they needed to withstand this threat, if they were run by a bunch of like separate workers councils with like different ideas about what to do and different values, like it wouldn't have fucking happened. It wouldn't have happened. You needed that strong centralized state in order to even make that happen in the first place. And without that, there is no USSR. And without that, the Nazis win World War II.
industrialization, for the
It
kind
is a
of
victory for socialism.
consolidation of forces and energy and economic resources at a scale that would have just been inconceivable under capitalism. Like, can you even imagine that kind of preparation under the Tsarist regime? Factories were built to be mobile, such that when faced with invasion from the West, they were literally shifted east so that production could continue throughout the war. And it was also, I think, a victory for the socialist system in the sense that working people, ordinary people, the masses, the vast majority of the population truly felt they had something to fight for. If you compare the fate of the Soviet Union and its actions in that war with what happened in France or what happened in Holland or Belgium or Hungary or any number of other countries, those countries' national armies collapsed in a question of days and weeks and months, right? The Soviet Union kept fighting and furthermore won, right? So this is a big part of that, is that people were in a society that was built for them, something that working people had never had before, there or anywhere else. And they were able to make extraordinary sacrifices to defend it. And, the whole thing has a certain tragic but important resonance today in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, right? Because where so much of the fighting is taking place now in the Donbass region, that's the same towns, the same cities, the same villages, that so much of that incredibly intense fighting took place in the Second World War. Yeah, and at that time it was Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians fighting together against a fascist enemy. And now we've got this tragic twist, this tragic inversion, because the Ukrainian paramilitaries who've been fighting on the front line in the Donbass against ethnic Russian people for the last 9 years are literally neo-Nazis.
Yeah,
we talk
are.
about celebrating Victory Day, and we think of the heroism of the Soviet people. You can't even celebrate that in Ukraine under kind of decommunization laws. The Soviet war memorials have been pulled down and replaced by statues of Stepan Bandera, who was a literal fascist. So these people, the Azov battalion, the right sector and so on, they've been recast as nationalists, but they're fascists, they're white supremacists, they're anti-Semites. So, all of this, the
Zelensky's Jewish. What?
Victory Day is a very important reminder of the success of the Soviet Union, as you've said, but also of what the Soviet Union and the anti-fascist peoples of the world fought for in that period.
Carlos, something that I learned a lot growing up in the United States whenever the issue of World War II came up is that if it wasn't for America, we'd all be speaking German. And so would all of Europe. Like, that's a constant. I mean, you know that too, Eugene. I'm sure you heard that at some point in school growing up and just from like random ignorant people. But another aspect of all of this that I think is very much connected to what you just mentioned about Ukraine today and the fact that NATO is basically supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine to do some of like the frontline fighting there against Russia is when we go back and we talk about Soviet history. I mean, part of the rise of fascism was, a result of wanting of people who could fight against communists, like the US and the UK and these capitalist countries were okay with Hitler until they weren't. Can you talk a little bit about that history of the rise of fascism and the fact that it was like allowed to proliferate and in some cases encouraged? Like we always hear about, Stalin made a deal with Hitler. We never really learn about, the West's role, the capitalist West's role.
Yeah, that's where history starts.
The rise of Hitler and other fascists.
History starts with Molotov-Ribbentrop.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Fascism historically has always arisen as a response to a combination of a crisis of capitalism. And if you think about the 1920s, 1930s, capitalism faced
Nazis that indeed were not only never prosecuted, but even given key roles in the FBI, police, Pinkertons, and a bunch of Gladio-run operations in EU and JP, and NATO. Let's not forget about NATO.
Most significant and substantial crisis that it's faced to date, in its history. And furthermore, a rise of an alternative ideology, an ideology of the working class, i.e. communism, socialism, Marxism, which was gaining strength massively. And there's no question that the ruling classes in Europe and the US, to a degree, supported the rise of Mussolini, supported the rise of Hitler, supported the rise of Franco. The Spanish Civil War is a perfectly good test case for that, because what side were the Americans on in the Spanish Civil War? What side were the British on? They didn't side with the Democrats. They didn't side with the Republicans.
In Canada, we made it illegal for citizens to go and volunteer to fight on the correct side of the Spanish Civil War. That's how much we were against fascism. We had brave Canadian people that wanted to go and fight for the Republicans and fight against fascism in Spain. And our government was like, no, under no circumstances. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to do that.
Because they had to maintain their posture as Democrats. But the fact is, they prevented any supplies from going to the Republican side, and they didn't do anything about the supplies that were going from Germany and Italy to the nationalist, to the fascist side. So all through that period, right up until the end of the 1930s, it was the clear aim and strategy of the Western powers, led by Britain, that Hitler should be leveraged against the Soviet Union. The whole process of kind of pacification and accepting what Hitler was doing in Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere was about, let's appease Hitler, let's give him what he wants, and let's just encourage him to go east and to fight against the Soviet Union. And then those two can exhaust each other. We'll kill two birds with one stone. It's very controversial to say so, but that strategy was ultimately defeated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. If it hadn't been for that pact, that would have been the trajectory of geopolitics in the late 1930s. Germany would have gone to war against the Soviet Union in 1939, and the Soviet Union would have lost 2.5 years of preparation, which proved to be absolutely crucial in the trajectory of that war.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an amazing history. And of course, they never tell us how the Soviet Union was desperately trying to work with the West and only, ended up where they were in 1939.
What's up with that, Don Dark Sony?
The inability there, but huge piece. But one of the other things I want to get to as well, and you've already sort of alluded this to a degree, the unique aspects of the Soviet Union that allowed them to resist, central planning in particular. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about what the Soviets were able to do in their society by planning it rather than just leaving it to the market as we do here in the capitalist West these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important for socialists and leftists to study the Soviet Union and to kind of own that experience, because apart from anything else, it had some stunning successes. We're always told that socialism doesn't work, right? And we're told that the Soviet Union was a failure.
By people like Noam Chomsky.
It was an authoritarian, miserable type of society. But actually, any serious analysis of history just doesn't bear that out at all. For one thing, the peoples of the territories of the Soviet Union experienced an absolutely unprecedented improvement in their living standards. Feudalism was wiped out, which is not a small thing.
That's what I've been saying.
The Soviet Union emerged from being a pretty backward, compared to Western Europe, compared to North America. Russia at that time was a backward state. And within a couple of decades, it was a superpower. It was one of two superpowers. It was the second biggest economy in the world. It became a global leader in multiple areas of science and technology. It became...
So many Western leftist ideologies refuse to own that experience and learn from it. And we're seeing the same thing repeat right now with China. This is why I think it's important to talk about this. Some people might think, why are you relitigating these arguments about the USSR? What does this benefit? Well, I do it because I think it's really irrelevant to exactly our current moment right now when this same thing is happening. We have this socialist state right now that's posing for the first time since the collapse of the USSR a genuine threat to Western hegemony and Western imperialism. And there's so many people that live in the heart of the empire making this exact same argument that Noam Chomsky was making in the 70s and 80s, saying, well, it's not really socialist. It's state capitalist. It's this, it's that. They're not pressing the socialism button. Workers don't own the state. Workers don't own the means of the production. They still have a state, and it's all the exact same arguments. So that's exactly why I think it's really important to focus on, because it's happening again right now and people are missing it. People are missing about this historical, amazing thing that's happening right now. This development that we've seen in China over the last couple of decades. It's this world historic thing. It's the thing that's now like, we've grown up in this totally unipolar, imperialist dominated global America. And we're seeing that challenge now for the first time in our fucking lifetimes, and people are missing it. It's this amazing thing. There's this like opportunity for people in the developing world and the global south to get away from the Western system and build infrastructure and build their societies in a different way. It's a hugely historic, amazing thing that we should be celebrating and learning from, and people are missing it. People are missing it again, and it's the exact same argument. So it's not socialist enough. It's not this, it's not that. They didn't do it the right way. It's violent. They didn't do whatever. It's like fucking Jesus Christ. That's exactly why I still think it's important to focus on. That's why I still think it's important to talk about the USSR and Stalin and the Cold War and all these things, because the exact same thing's going on right now, and people are making the exact same arguments, and they're missing it again. And that's why I feel the need to go on Twitch and TikTok, even though I feel like sometimes I'm in the extreme minority about these things. I feel like I'm in the extreme minority, but I still think it's important to push back on these things.
A pioneer in arts and culture. For the first time in Russian history, famine stopped being a problem. The Soviet Union built the first comprehensive welfare state, the first country to have free education at all levels, the first country to have free healthcare and a guarantee of housing available to everyone. Universal literacy was achieved in a matter of 2 decades. It was even, and this is, I think, really surprising to a lot of people, the USSR was a trailblazer on gender equality. Where did women first get the right to vote? Where did they first get freedom to divorce? Where did they first get, the right to abortion and bodily autonomy?
Women were going into space.
What country?
Women were going into space when all women were allowed to be at NASA, the Nazi-infested U.S. government organization. They were just allowed to be fucking secretaries, and they were maybe allowed to do the math. They were allowed to do some of the math, but they weren't actually allowed to go into space. And female cosmonauts in the Soviet Union were doing that decades before that.
Country was it that innovated on childcare provision and socialization of domestic labor? It was the Soviet Union. Actually, this is an interesting statistic. By the 1970s, there were more female doctors in the Soviet Union than in the whole, rest of the world combined. It was an affirmative action state. It was an anti-racist state. Racial and ethnic discrimination were banned, were made punishable offenses long before that was the case in the US or Britain. At that time, in the 1930s, African Americans faced what in the United States? Lynching and segregation. So
I'm going to get both Carlos and
very
Eugene on the show too.
Civil rights leaders and Black American activists such as W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Langston Hughes going to the Soviet Union and saying things like, this is the first place that I've been that I'm treated with dignity and respect as a human being. The unemployment problem was solved. Capitalism still hasn't found a way to solve the unemployment problem or the housing problems. But in the Soviet Union, they were solved in, humanity's very first socialist experiment, right? And as we've been talking about, fascism was defeated. They built a country that was sufficiently strong, sufficiently advanced, united, and determined that it could defeat the Nazi armies. And, Victory Day, as I say, is a reminder of that, of how much humanity owes the Soviet people and how much they contributed to creating the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there we go. I lost you for a second there, Carlos. You are back with us now, but I really appreciate this. Sorry, Ronnie, did I cut you off?
No, I was just cheering for the little box rearrangement.
Yes, absolutely crucial. Well, Carlos, as always, we really appreciate you having you with us. I just have to plug it again. The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. Whether you know a lot or a little about the Soviet Union, I'm telling you, this book is fascinating, very important. You should study it. You should read it. You can get it from Left Word Books, and if you're in the U.S.,
I need to get that book.
1804 Books.
Carlos is great. That was fucking fantastic. I'm glad he summarized a lot of the things that I was talking about in that TikTok clip. Probably in a more academic, less Canadian stoner way, as I do. By the way, look at this comment I got on TikTok already. Look at this comment. You see the shit I have to put up with, chat? See the shit that I have to put up with? This person says, Still J says, wait, random guy on social media with bedhead and crusties on his lip is smarter than Noam fucking Chomsky. Lol. Right. The very Reddit comment. But again, that's not an argument. That does not address anything that I said there. That does not address any of the criticisms that I made or any of the arguments that I made. It's not an argument. Even if I do have crusties on my lip or a bedhead, or if maybe I was high when I made that response. Maybe I was. But I wasn't wrong, though. That's the main thing. I wasn't wrong. Yes, you've seen Chomsky lately. He's all bedhead, all crust. If that's what we're using to like discredit people, I don't know if we want to go down that road. What do I have to wear a fucking suit on TikTok in order to make these arguments? Is that what I have to do? I gotta put on a tux to talk about this stuff? Chomsky's so smart he had Epstein be his accountant. Yeah, that's right. Totally reclining theory Rob is too fucking cool for him. I really was. I do like making those videos when I'm just relaxing on my sofa like that. I was very reclined. I was very comfy. In my element. The Radlibs don't even like Chomsky anymore. He's too willing to see shades of gray in Ukraine. For sure. And Chomsky, I think, has been pretty good on Ukraine. Like, in everything. Like, and he's been working with Vijay Prashad, who's definitely someone that does not have that view of the Soviet Union, all these things. So, I mean, I still, regardless of all the problems I have with Chomsky, I still think he does work that's really valuable. I think the Epstein thing is fucking disturbing. I don't know what's going on with that and his weird defensive reaction to it. You know, I think even if you're meeting with a billionaire, you might think it might advance your career. If they've been convicted of sex trafficking teenagers in the past, I think that's just generally a sign that you shouldn't associate with them. Even if it's like, oh, I might get access to this or I might get some funding for this. Generally just people you want to stay away from, in my opinion, you know? If someone that's been convicted of sex trafficking asks you to come hang out with Woody Allen, I'm going to say, like, you know what? I think I'm going to pass. I think it's going to be better for everyone if I just go ahead and give this one a miss. And you got a bunch of money from Epstein. Okay. Jeffrey Epstein moved $270,000 for Noam Chomsky and paid $150,000 to Leon Botstein. I don't know, Noam. I think that's pretty fun. It's pretty messed up, if you ask me. I think generally it's a good idea to try and avoid those types, personally. That's my personal stance on that. One step into Epstein's house, you'd think, oh, this is a pedophile. I mean, this regardless of anything, he had been convicted already. He had been arrested and convicted of sex crimes prior to that. Generally, maybe that's just a sign that it's not someone you want to associate with. I don't know. Is there any real non-pedophilia reason to meet with Epstein? I don't know. I mean, like, he had his fingers in all these different like medical research and stuff, and people love money, especially people in academia. They're like, oh, I can get a grant or whatever. So in theory, yes, but it's like no one's going to remember any of that stuff. You know, no one's going to remember. No one's going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Oh yeah, I knew he was a pedophile. I knew he was convicted of sex trafficking, but I really needed this grant though. It's like, well, maybe you should just find a grant somewhere else. He had his finger in a lot of pies. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Absolutely right. Yeah, for sure. Like, why would he need to be the grant guy? And like, Chomsky's written a bunch of books. Like, I think he's doing okay. You know, just write another book or whatever. Get an advance from Random House or something. Chomsky served hot water to his guests because he didn't realize the Keurig used disposable cups. Chomsky can never be wrong. Is that true, Lodane? What are you doing, Gnome? What are you doing? Let's see. We'll see if this TikTok has 150 views so far. We'll see if it gets any more action. I'm just going to put it on one more time. I was happy with this. Reclining theory, Rob. More and more people are talking about how it's a trustworthy individual.
There hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Noam Chomsky's done a lot of work that I think is very valuable, but this is unfortunately another common Noam L, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, this whole idea that the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, I think is very silly on its face. I mean, maybe it makes sense if your understanding of socialism is just the workers owning the means of production, and not a process of struggle that the Soviet Union was indeed engaged in. A struggle to build that kind of system, to build that kind of classless, stateless society. But there was a lot of obstacles to building that system. They were under threat from moment one from Western imperialism because they represented a threat to the hegemony of these colonialist powers and their financial interests. They were also under this growing fascist threat coming from Germany, which culminated in a war that killed 29 million people in the Soviet Union. That war would have gone the other way were it not for that incredible sacrifice. And despite all these massive obstacles, they still did in the Soviet Union raise living standards for millions of people. They overthrew this czarist system. They overthrew feudalism. All of a sudden, millions of people had access to healthcare and literacy, education, and basic social services. These things just didn't exist prior to the existence of the Soviet Union. That's an incredible accomplishment. And yes, it is democratic considering the fact that for these millions of people who had access to all these benefits of this socialist process, they didn't have democracy prior to that. In the czarist system, it was a huge improvement for millions and millions of people, an improvement in their lives. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Noam Chomsky celebrated, living standards for these millions of people just dropped off a fucking cliff. Suicide rate shot up. Alcoholism and drug addiction, sex trafficking, life expectancy, access to education and healthcare, all these things just plummeted. It was a massive human rights disaster for millions of people in Russia and elsewhere in these former Soviet republics. So yes, the Soviet Union was engaged in building socialism. And were there mistakes that happened? Were there contradictions? Sure there were. But I think if you live in the West, if you live in the heart of the empire, then you should stand in solidarity with people around the world, wherever they are, that are trying to build something, that are engaged in this struggle, and not do whatever the hell Noam was doing in this clip. Also, Noam, why did you meet with Jeffrey Epstein? That's super weird, dude. Okay. Maybe I'm changing hearts and minds. Changing hearts and minds on TikTok. Okay, so in a few moments we got Kala Walsh coming on. I'm not prepared at all for this. I am not prepared at all. I would like to say before Kala Walsh comes on, which will just be in 10 minutes, we're going to talk about her trip to Cuba that she just took, about why it's important to show I talk about upholding the USSR and being in solidarity with people around the world that are trying to build something. That includes Cuba as well, obviously. And we're going to talk to Kala Walsh about that in just a few minutes. It's going to be really great stuff. And again, I've talked about how some I think young people, while they might have more progressive ideas, also have kind of somewhat backwards ideas and counter-revolutionary ideas when it comes to being internationalist. And that's why Kala and the work that some of her colleagues are doing is something that gives me kind of a good feeling deep down inside. say I could send Chomsky the email. I don't want to bother him. I don't know. He's so fucking old. I just want to leave him alone, you know? Okay, thanks for stopping by, Redmond Barry, for the debate. I appreciate it. So Kala is going to come on in like 8 minutes. Before she comes on, if you think that it's important that I do this kind of commentary here on Twitch or TikTok or wherever, please, if you can, subscribe to TRRS. You know, it costs $5 to subscribe to TRRS, or it's completely free of charge with an Amazon Prime account. You get all the wonderful emotes. You can join this wonderful community. You can gift 5 subs or above to rocket right up to the very tip top of the friendship triangle system. That's Twitch's only 2-dimensional triangle-shaped trickle-down clout and friendship access tiered reward system. There's a lot of Twitch channels out there. There's millions of them, in fact, but there's only one friendship triangle system, and gifting 5 subs or above will rock you right up to the very top of that system.
Through all this.
Including one of the most elite members, who, as an elite member of the friendship triangle system, you will have access to. Don Dark Sony, thank you for the 3 gifted subs. Wow, a total of 666 gifted subs. Curious. My number doesn't seem to be going up. I mean, it looks like I'm gonna have to do that manually, unless it's just caught up. It's like I think I fucked up my Stream Elements settings by trying to block people from being able to use racial slurs in my chat.
Good old Rob to talk you through all this.
I will figure it out though. And thank you, Gen X Bushy, for the 2 gifted subs as well. And does anyone else? I guess I'll do a whole pitch segment after. I'll do the whole dinner party thing. Is there just like one more thing we can watch for 5 minutes? Or you know what? We'll just it was kind of fun doing this. Let's just have a 5-minute dinner party segment. If anyone else wants to subscribe, I appreciate it a lot. I just want to jot down a few quick questions that I can ask Kala Walsh, which as a professional journalist I probably should have done a while ago. So if anyone else wants to support this show and support this community, please subscribe to TRRS. I really appreciate it a lot, and it really helps. It really helps keep this content on the air. And again, I think it's important to have this viewpoint on Twitch. I don't think enough people are upholding this kind of viewpoint. Do you have any other takers? And I will make sure the number actually goes up. What is this, man? Okay, yeah. I'm gonna bookmark this.
Count on me. You're going to have a good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Thank you, Comrade Social Distancing, a.k.a. Diego, for the 2 gifted subs. I love it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I don't know why my shit's not going up now. Why? It even says... the other takers, folks, before the interview starts, you still have a chance to subscribe to TRRS and support this content and make it so when I have guests come on, you know, they're not embarrassed. Be like, who's this Lobie?
You can count on me. You're gonna have a good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Who's this? Was this amateur
Hello, I am
hour over here?
supporting this content.
You can count on me. You're gonna have a good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Yeah, I'll mute the alerts. I almost said I would alert the mutes. I was so close just now to saying I'll alert the mutes. Oh, shit. One sec, I gotta update my payment information on Zoom.
You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
Who's this? What is this now? What's going on? Where's my screen? What's happening? What's happening? What is this? Plunger Man. Plunger Man, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Plunger Man.
You've just become an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
Why is this now? Sir Brain Damage, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. Oh my god, that's very kind of you, Sir Brain Damage. And you also resubbed 2 minutes ago for 15 months, Tier 1. Sir Brain Damage, thank you for all the support. That's so kind of you. Thank you. And thank you, Ben and PS, as well, for the gifted sub. Thank you. Very, very kind of you. This now? Is this fixed? Okay. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and mute the alerts. I don't know why my fucking shit is not working properly. Here's my Zoom. Meeting. I gotta turn off the dinner vibe. I'm glad people like that though. That's fun. That's fun. And who is this now? Hey, Kella, how's it going? I'm just getting started here. I'm just getting started. Thank you, Dave, for the 18 months of Tier 1. Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Don Dark Sony, for gifting a sub to Kalla Walsh. We brought Kalla onto Twitch for the very first time. I'm the old guy, and now I'm bringing Zoomers onto this platform. What the fuck's going on here? What is going on? It's supposed to be the other way around. Cal, I'll send you the Zoom invite in just 1 sec. I'm just getting that going here. And Cal, I just have a question. Could you send the invite to your colleague Jeff? Would you mind doing that? Or Joshua, sorry. Jesus Christ. I'm DMing you the link right now. I'm DMing you the Zoom invite link. If you could just go ahead and share that with Joshua, you can both jump on the call. Okay? So let me do this. Get this out of here. Or can I turn this into Zoom? No. Zoom, put that. Okay, there's my Zoom. Good. Change the title. I'll be with you in just 1 sec. Just putting my title. I'm doing everything on the fly here. Doing everything on the fly. Producing the show while people are watching. Figuring out how everything works. Doing it all with a crowd of people watching you. Hello, Kyle, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hello.
How's it going?
It's going very well. Sorry to keep you waiting there.
Don't worry about it.
Were you able to share the invite link with Joshua?
Yep. I just sent it to him at 2:04, so I'll tell him to join now if possible.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, here he goes. Here's Joshua entering the room right now. Good.
Hey, Joshua.
Awesome. Joshua, hello.
Hey, peace, free the land. What's up?
Oh, not much. Just doing the old Twitch stream, and I'm excited to have both of you come on here to talk to us. This is really cool. We got Kala Walsh and Joshua. Joshua, sorry, what's your last name? Reeves.
Reeves.
Yes.
Yep.
Do you two just want to just give us a little introduction? Just say hello to the chat, introduce yourself, and just kind of describe the work that you do and why you're here today?
Yeah, let's do it. So I can go first and then pass it to Joshua. But my name is Kala. I'm one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba. We are an umbrella organization for 57 different groups in the US that are all united around the cause of ending the blockade on Cuba and normalizing US-Cuba relations. And part of our work is leading solidarity travel to Cuba, which is really important because the US doesn't want us to go to Cuba. They don't want us to learn the Cuban reality beyond this anti-communist propaganda we're fed. And we just got back from the 16th International May Day Brigade, where we were in Cuba celebrating May Day, International Workers' Day. And we had a bigger group than many delegations in years past. And it was a really amazing trip. So I'm super excited to talk more about it.
Yeah. And I'm Josh. I use he, him. I'm coming from Philly. And I'm an organizer with the Malcolm X grassroots movements, Philly chapter, and Black Alliance for Peace. I'm a really new member to Black Alliance for Peace, which I believe is a member organization of the National Network on Cuba. So that's sort of how I heard about the brigade. I really want to echo everything Kala was saying about like the strength and resiliency of the Cuban people against genocide. You know, it takes a lot of strength to be in their position as a people, and you can see like how revolutionary and sophisticated people are, and still how kind and whatnot. But we can definitely hop into that.
Yeah.
After intros.
Well, why don't you just, well, again, it's great to have both of you on the program. I'm very happy to be speaking to both of you. And I'm really interested, first and foremost, in just hearing about this trip and how it went. So, like, why don't we start there? Like, how was it? What did you get up to in Cuba? How did you find the reception? And what were your impressions from after getting home from this solidarity trip?
I can start, and honestly, I don't really know where to start since we were there for 2 weeks for our brigade, and I stayed a few days after, and we did a lot. You know, every day our schedule was packed, and we were visiting hospitals, universities, workplaces, learning about the Cuban Revolution, not as a historic event, but as an ongoing process in which every Cuban citizen is participating. And I guess I'll talk a little bit about May Day since that was the main event of why we were there. And May Day is a huge holiday in Cuba. Every worker has the day off, and almost every year they have this huge celebration in La Plaza de la Revolucion in Havana. And I think it bears really big contrast to the US, where despite May Day having originated from the Haymarket riots in Chicago, it's not actually a holiday in the US. Instead, we have Labor Day, which is really a day where working class people have to serve rich people who get the day off and don't have to work.
What's the super dystopian name that they use for May Day now in America? Is it like Loyalty Day or something super disturbing like that?
Know. Josh, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know, but I do remember they named it like something stupid like that, like Patriotism Day or American Loyalty Day or something.
Awesome.
Geez. But May Day this year was very different from years past in Cuba. I was in Cuba for May Day last year, actually. That was my first time traveling to Cuba, and I got to participate in the huge parade with millions of Cubans in Havana. But this year, the effects of the blockade have really gotten worse, specifically around fuel shortages, which are causing a huge crisis because, of course, fuel is what is keeping the economy running. So transportation is really limited. Public transit is in much lower service. It's hard to keep factories, machineries running. And even for, kids to get to school, a lot of classes at universities were moved online because it was so hard for professors and students to get to the school. And that changed the May Day plans. And of course, these fuel shortages exist because the US is literally blocking ships coming with fuel to bring to Cuba, and also because some scheduled fuel deliveries from other countries weren't carried out. But May Day this year, instead of having the huge celebration in Havana, it was too hard to transport workers from all around the country into the main city. So there were smaller local celebrations, and they took place on May 5th instead of May 1st, because the day before May 1st, there were some bad storms which damaged infrastructure. But again, being there and seeing all the adaptations Cuba had to make was even more evidence of how cruel and genocidal this blockade is. And we still had an amazing revolutionary May Day celebration, and we saw the resiliency of the Cuban people who have persisted for over 60 years despite every attempt by the US to subvert them.
Joshua, did you want to go ahead?
Yep. Yeah, I'll just echo on to that. It was we had a really packed 2 weeks there. So summarizing it in like a little bite-sized way is really hard. And every experience, I'll say, like every experience that we had interacting with the Cuban people or Cuban institutions or Cuban organizations, it was so like deep, and like the way of societal relations there is totally different to anything I've ever encountered in the United States, and it is really just to, again, echo Kala's point, like every Cuban's playing a part in the revolutionary process. They have like a really, really sophisticated and highly developed like concept of organizational unity, like the sort of Maoist like unity model. It extends like really far in ways that I hadn't expected to see. And also, I think one of the highlights for me personally, just the May Day, there were so many. There was one every day, but one of the real high points was getting to hear the president speak. President Miguel Diaz-Canel, I believe is his name. He's like the first non-Castro president, which means he's the first president to not have participated. Like he didn't participate in the like armed struggle of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So I feel like his presidency is both like this sign of the resiliency of the Cuban Revolution beyond like the phase of armed struggle to the phase that it's in right now. And he really spoke to like this idea that Cubans are participating in like creative resistance every day against imperialism by surviving. Like in fuel lines, like people play dominoes, people dance, people listen to music, and there's this sort of like solidarity that's a part of the Cuban national character that I think that they're really proud of, and we got to experience in a lot of different ways that makes them a really, really resilient people to what is fairly described as genocide, you know, which is like an economic war that's been going on against them for 60 years. I think like this solidarity and spirit and love and action and all this stuff has played like a really huge role and really definitive role even in our 2 weeks of being there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I thought was really cool about President Diaz-Canel was when that kind of like astroturfed like SOS Cuba protest movement was going on, which I think was a relatively small movement there. But one thing that I did think that was very cool was when that kicked off in Cuba, how the president literally just got out and started going and mixing with the people that were protesting and start talking to them and saying, what do we need to talk about? What is the problem? And kind of engaging with them in that way, which is just such a completely unthinkable thing when you live in the West. The idea of like a powerful political figure actually going into these protest movements to speak to them of like what their issues are. Which totally flies in the face about the narrative that was told to us about those protests. They were crushed or whatever, which there's really no evidence of when we can often see, you know, protest movements in the West about police violence or whatever else actually being physically crushed with brutal violence, brutal state violence. And that you saw a complete inversion of that.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because to me that like just totally, like even the president doing that isn't a surprise, and it's not like an abnormal action just because of the way like the legislature interacts with the people in Cuba. Like one of the things that we learned about, and maybe Kala will have some more of the facts around it, but we learned about how the Cuban Constitution was completely rewritten in a process like a multi-year process that ended in 2019. I believe, but like that, the whole process to arrive to that point involved like Communist Party members meeting with community organizations, meeting with labor unions, you know, and like people's offices would be places where people would talk about the new constitution, people's homes, like their after school activities, you know, in sports and whatnot. So just like the whole concept of like political engagement is really, really people driven in a way that I think like I couldn't even conceptualize until going there, you know, like I think we're so used to politicians only acting in their own interests and like flying in and like faking all this goodwill and charity, that like to see a political system that's actually at service of the people, like meant to serve the people and is serving the people, is totally different.
Yeah, just to add on in a few places there, meeting President Miguel Diaz-Canel was incredible. Robbie mentioned the July 11th protest, which of course came out of Miami. The first tweet saying SOS Cuba came out of Miami, and were really meant to take advantage of the hardships Cubans were experiencing during the worst of the pandemic and under the blockade and Trump's added sanctions, to take advantage of that real discontent and to turn it into protests against the Cuban government, which obviously is not the reason that there are shortages, the reason that there's economic hardship. It's because of US sanctions. And what's so ridiculous is that when Miguel Diaz-Canel went out and talked with Cubans who were protesting and heard their concerns, the US mainstream media actually used footage of him and claimed that that was part of a counter protest. So they're just using footage of revolutionary Cubans who were actually protesting in defense of the revolution, and they claimed that those were counter protesters. So it was extremely misleading. But it was incredible to meet the president. I've never met a president before. Most of us have never met a president before, and most of us were youth from the US. And I think that says a lot that the Cuban president cares more about our concerns and our struggles than Joe Biden does. Because of course, Joe Biden doesn't care about us. He cares about his donors. But what Miguel Diaz-Canel said to us when he was speaking was that our trips show that the US does not just bring, sanctions, bombs, counter-revolution to Cuba, that we also bring solidarity from the US people. And Cuba has always understood that the voice of the US people is very different than how our government is acting. And just to add on to what Joshua was saying about the Cuban Constitution, learning about Cuba's socialist, people-powered, consultative democracy genuinely, helped me realize even more that we are just centuries behind in the US. Our Constitution was written 300 years ago by slave owners who'd never seen a light switch before, and virtually no people actually have any say in that document. Whereas in Cuba, it was a process that involved a vast majority of the population, millions of people writing directly changes into the Constitution that were then drafted and redrafted and voted upon by everyone. And one thing I'll highlight, because I actually wrote an article about this last year when I was in Cuba, because we were there when the announcement about Roe v. Wade being overturned first came out. And I was really interested in learning about the right to abortion in Cuba and how that is enshrined in the Constitution to be free for all, to be done only by medical professionals. And I learned recently that a lot of Cuban citizens living in Miami and Florida actually come to Cuba to get free abortions, which I feel like really just shows that Cuba, is really way more advanced than the US in these areas, and our rights are being stripped away in the US for abortion, for democracy. And despite everything the US claims about Cuba, really the opposite is the case.
You have that Cuban family law that was just passed as well, while trans people and other people in the LGBTQIA community in America and Canada are being targeted right now by these like nonstop reactionary assaults trying to take their rights away and destroy their identities. You have Cuba like solidifying their rights and solidifying the rights of these kind of marginalized groups in a way that we're not even anywhere near approaching. I also wanted to mention, like you talked about the fuel shortages that led to the lack of the kind of May Day celebrations that they wanted to do. You talk about the shortages and the things that were going on that led up to those the discontent and the protests that we saw, which were, like I was pointing out and like you mentioned, were astroturfed as well by these kind of reactionary forces in the West. But I think that really does kind of like exemplify the kind of certain kind of cruelty of the way that the West engages in this kind of like economic imperialism or these siege tactics, and the way Cuba, and not even just Cuba, but like North Korea, the DPRK, and other targets of U.S. sanctions, Venezuela, and all these other places are targeted with these economic policies that deliberately limit their ability to feed the population, to import medicine, and to do all these important things, to import fuel, and deliberately make life more difficult for millions of people that live in that region. And then the kind of fucked up way that kind of very real poverty and very real economic consequences of this are then are held up as an example of why socialism doesn't work. Say, you think socialism works? So like, go to Cuba, look, all the paint's peeling off the walls, and it's poor, and the people don't have enough to eat, and whatever people want to say. But really, the fact that the Cuban Revolution is still standing strong so many decades later, and that there still is this social safety net, and there still is the people still do have the ability to see a doctor despite all the limitations and the shortages. That to me is an amazing victory of socialism. It's an amazing victory of the Cuban Revolution. But here in the West, we end up taking these consequences, these economic sanctions and the blockades, and then holding that up as a example of how socialism doesn't work, which is the completely backwards way of what we should be understanding it.
No, exactly. And of course, the stated purpose of the US blockade when it first started was to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. But because of the economic devastation that the blockade has caused, and it's really targeted at areas of infrastructural development that could pull Cuba out from the suffering that it's in right now because of the blockade. And it's keeping Cuba from fully developing. But Cuba has still it's achieved incredible development, especially in areas of science and medicine, where they are so much more advanced than our systems in the US. But the blockade has also served as this tool for the US to say, this is proof that socialism doesn't work. But in reality, socialism is the reason that Cuba has maintained its system and maintained a healthier, more educated population, higher life expectancy than the US, despite having so much less and being so much poorer. So socialism is really proof, or Cuba's proof, that socialism works, even in the face of the most severe and prolonged sanctions in the history of the world.
Yeah, that was really, really well said, Kala. So I won't repeat too much of that, but socialism has definitely advanced Cuba so it's so clear that this country exemplifies like the values of like human progress and placing people at the center of a society. And in that sense, like they are light years ahead of like the United States. And I also want to add on to the comment about sanctions. Not only are like there terrible economic effects to like the sanctions that we see, but the US, and in the case of Cuba and all the other countries that you mentioned, like that are on sanctions list, the US is also actively involved in regime change efforts outside of the sanctions. So saying like the economic warfare is one side of it, but the other side of it in the case of Cuba is the US Navy will intercept ships that are trying to deliver oil to Cuba, take all the oil, and then sell it for itself. The US has funded, I think openly, I want to say 611 attempts on like Fidel Castro's life during his lifetime. That's what the CIA has admitted to. Like there was of course like the Bay of Pigs invasion back in 1962, but after that the US was preparing a full naval invasion for years. Like the US has sponsored like right-wing terrorism propaganda and like decades worth of anti-sovereignty work in Cuba, like to create a culture of desperation and violence that has resulted in like the actual murder of at least 4,000 people through terrorist actions done by like US armed right-wing Cubans, but like many, many more due to the effects of the blockade, which has like completely like stopped progress on things that are totally achievable by Cuba if it just had fair trade relations with the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to mention. It's just like with the value system that you see in place in Cuba that you two were able to experience, you can't help but wonder like what they would be able to accomplish as a society just if they were able to trade with the United States, and they didn't have these massive economic restrictions on them for the last several decades. It's the cruelty is really amazing when you think about like how they've been limited and what they've still been able to accomplish despite all these limitations. So, like, tell me a little bit more about this trip. Like, you talked about meeting President Diaz-Canel. Like, I'm just interested in some of the other activities and things that you participated in. Like, did you like the kind of workplaces that you visited? Do you have any other like just anecdotes about your time there and the people you were able to spend time with while you were there?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about two highlights of the trip for me, which were volunteering at an urban garden, which we did for 3 mornings, and then also visiting a sugarcane plant and exchanging with unionized Cuban sugar workers. And the historical context for, Cuba's agricultural system, and especially with sugarcane, is that Cuba was developed into this monocrop economy, first by Spanish colonialism and then by US neocolonialism. And since the revolution, they've been trying to develop out of that sort of dependency model where their entire economy is based on exporting sugar to the empire. And so after the revolution, sugar was still a really big crop for Cuba. The first solidarity brigades that came to the US helped with the sugar harvest, and often this was exported to the socialist bloc, even though they were already producing their own sugar. But this year, Cuba has actually had one of the smallest sugar harvests in 100 years, I think. And that's because their ability to process the sugar is really limited by the blockade, the lack of fuel, the lack of machinery, and simply spare parts, nuts and bolts for the machinery. So Cuba has been diversifying their agriculture, and also so much greenery and forest has grown back since the revolution because land is actually redistributed to the people instead of these huge United States landowners that are just exploiting the land. So we volunteered at an urban garden, and I'm not like an agricultural expert, so I wish I could say a lot more of this in a more profound way. But Cuba developed this really extensive urban farming system after the fall of the USSR in the special period when they had to have a lot more food sovereignty and be able to produce for the local communities. And so much of what we ate was grown within like a mile away. And there's virtually no pesticides used at all in Cuba, pretty much because they can't import it because of the blockade. But food is very limited by the blockade. But one thing I really appreciated was, how fresh everything is and how connected people are to the food that they're eating, which is obviously something that we're going to have to work towards in the US after a revolution here, I hope. But volunteering in the urban garden was an awesome experience. We performed 3 months of labor in one morning in like 3 or 4 hours just by volunteering there. And then we did 2 more mornings of volunteering, just helping with the daily tasks at the farm. And then we visited this sugarcane factory where the plant is processed, where they have labs where scientists are researching different uses for sugarcane, and they've been able to produce hundreds of different byproducts of sugarcane. So we visited labs where they're producing like hand sanitizer made with sugarcane, also where they're sampling like so many different kinds of rum, which is really cool to see in the labs. But learning about the innovation that Cuba has been able to achieve despite of the blockade, and also because of the blockade, because of this limitation of resources that is created, Cuba has had to get really creative with how they are producing for themselves and continuing to survive in the face of these harsh sanctions. And the last thing I'll say about that visit is that when we were at the sugarcane factory, there was also a comrade there who was representing the sugarcane union in the Dominican Republic, and he was speaking about how different the experience of sugarcane workers are there versus in Cuba, where in the DR, they're basically treated like slaves and have no labor rights, are completely exploited. People die in the fields. Whereas in Cuba, the sugar workers actually, controlled their own futures. And sorry, one last thing that I'll mention is that after visiting the sugarcane plant, we got to go to a beach place and celebrate with the workers. And one really cool thing is that after the revolution, all these luxury resorts that were previously for, US Western tourists were redistributed among all the different unions. So each union was designated a different like beach resort basically to use for recreation, for their families, and for their enjoyment. So that was really awesome to see.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll say some personal highlights for me in no like particular order. There's a new museum called the Fidel Castro Ruz Center in Havana that's dedicated to like the life, the ideas of not only Fidel, but also like the Cuban Revolution broadly. I found that to be like a really, really moving experience, not only because it like really humanized the person that Fidel was, you saw the love that the Cuban people had for him and what made him such like a powerful and profound leader for Cubans throughout times of crisis. But it was so much bigger than like the individual too. Like parts of the museum where all the museum from its offset, like Fidel had an order before he passed that was like to not create a cult of personality around him. So not to name streets, not to name universities, not to name libraries, not to name stuff after them. So, but the Cuban people like couldn't help it. So they had to name something after him. So they made this beautiful museum that's like both incredibly technologically advanced and like highly interactive from a technology standpoint. Like there were tons of different touchscreen exhibitions, so much so that we didn't get to like even go halfway into the depth of all of them. They had recently made and really interesting footage about Fidel's life, a memorial to him, essentially stories from like the Bay of Pigs invasion by US mercenaries and the CIA. So all of that was really interesting, but really what moved me most was like just the process by which they arrived to it, which was like through a series of community meetings across the island, but focused in Havana. And in particular in the library section of it, there's a library that's dedicated to like words about Fidel and memorials to him. but they asked the children of Havana how they would want it to be designed. They met with like the Young Communist League and other like youth associations, and the kids wanted it to be like Harry Potter's library. So it's like an all wooden library with like a spiral staircase and these floor to ceiling like bookshelves. So I think it's really beautiful just how much it really speaks to how people driven it is. So that was one example that really stuck out to me. But another one was sort of impromptu. We had a meeting with this organization, Red Barriel Afrodescente, which is the largest organization of Afro-Cubans in Cuba. And that was like, because in the US, because like the racial situation here is so much predicated on like settler colonial identity and like racist politics around that, like the US has started to create a misinformation campaign about race and racism in Cuba, saying that Cuban Black people like are suffering under a regime of like socialist white supremacy,
or so that they were doing colonialism in Angola and these places.
Yeah, exactly. Stuff that's like totally unfounded, you know. So
by sending doctors there.
Yeah, exactly. But being able to meet with people who identified with being Afro-Cuban, like meeting Afro-Cuban leaders who aren't like necessarily a part of the Communist Party or a part of the government, who like are independent but aren't like US state funded. That was like a really enlightening experience, I would say, because this organization it's led by Black women, Afro-Cuban women, and it's using, I want to say, like Paulo Freire's model of like popular education seminars. Like they go together and do like popular education seminars and like workshops about like Afro-Cuban history and issues that are still going on in the country. But one of the main takeaways, and one of the things Maritza, who's one of the founders of it, told us was that like the blockade is strangling Afro-Cubans. It's the cause of like suffering for African people in Cuba, and like that she was a supporter of the revolution, and she even described like the Afro-Cuban movement in Cuba as a revolution within a revolution. So I think like this whole sort of this counter-revolutionary narrative that's emerging about Afro-Cubans is absolutely being manipulated by the state. And we even saw a video come out about it that was like that happened right around when people like Black US activists and activists of color were returning from Cuba and getting harassed by TSA at the border. You know, so there's a pretty sophisticated disinformation campaign coming in from the US about the experience of Afro-Cubans and what it means to be Afro-Cuban. So to be able to learn directly from someone who's like, that's the purpose of their organizing work, is around Afro-Cubans, that really helped to shift my expectations about the revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so important too, given that, especially that the way that this argument gets always made is like, oh, you support Cuba, you think the Cuban Revolution was good. Well, why don't you listen to the Cubans or listen to the Afro-Cubans? And it's always some reactionary in Florida that has nothing to do with Cuba, that doesn't live there. And we never actually engage with what people that are involved in that struggle have to say. We're not interested in that. We only want to hear from people coming from that specific ideological background, right? I also wanted to talk about Chris Smalls, because he was in Cuba as well at the same time. And Kala, there was a bit of controversy because I saw you two were in a picture together, and then people started trying to cancel you, both actually, and were saying, "Oh, he's just becoming an influencer. You know, why is this Amazon union organizer showing up in Cuba and hanging out with the Cuban president and all this stuff?" And really, like, I think it should be obvious why union organizers in America or elsewhere in the West should have this kind of sense of internationalism and should be talking to revolutionaries in other places such as Cuba. To me, that seems clear, but do you want to just speak a little bit about that, about why it's important, I think, for people, not just Chris Smalls himself, but anyone that's involved in that kind of working class struggle in America or Canada or elsewhere, why it's important to go to Cuba and learn from this, learn from the Cuban Revolution?
Yeah, of course. So Chris was part of a delegation with US Hands Off Cuba, and there were dozens of labor organizers and union members on their trip who were directly invited by the CTC, the National Congress of Cuban Trade Unions. And they were invited to learn about the labor movement in Cuba, to learn about all the rights that Cuban workers have that we don't have yet. And because it's our duty as working people in the US, especially for labor organizers, to be anti-imperialist and to see the connections between these class struggles, not just within our borders, but internationally. And so it was really, really significant that Chris came, that all the Amazon Labor Union members and members of other unions came. We had several union organizers on our trip as well. And I think all the hate was by people who fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of the trip. Because some people think, oh, we're just in Cuba to have a tropical vacation, but that couldn't be further from the truth. First of all, tourism is illegal for U.S. people in Cuba. We have to go under a specific travel license. Our trip, NNOC, went under the category support for the Cuban people. But we're there to exchange with the Cuban people to learn about their struggle under the blockade and to bring all that back, not only to help lift the blockade in the US, but also because everything Cuba has accomplished can really help us learn how to best organize ourselves in the US, which is why it's so significant to have labor organizers come into Cuba. And just to add a little bit more onto that, Cubans first and foremost are impacted by the blockade and live day to day with the awful effects of these sanctions. But I think when we're trying to, persuade people in the US and the West why the blockade getting lifted is important, I think we should also talk about how we're impacted by the blockade, because it impacts all of us. It's not just the blockade on trade, it's the impact of people-to-people exchanges. We are, deprived of the incredible contributions the Cuban people have made to the world. And we're also banned from, having access to incredible medical innovations from Cuba, such as their lung cancer vaccine, their diabetes ulcers treatment, which could literally save hundreds of thousands of lives in the US. And not only that, but also prevent like hundreds of thousands of amputations from people with diabetes in the US. So I recommend people look into those. But I think what's most significant is that now the ALU and these other unions are bringing back the fight to end the blockade to their unions and to the US. And the NNOC is organizing some big protests in June, specifically against the state sponsors of terrorism list, and Cuba's designation as a so-called state sponsor of terror, which the Biden administration is upholding with literally zero evidence.
Preposterous.
Yeah. So I'll let Josh add on, but I'd love to talk more about the protests in a bit and go further into depth on how people can get involved there.
Yeah, please. But Joshua, did you have something?
Okay. Yeah, I'll just be quick. I just on the point of how the blockade is harming like people's here. Like I think Cuba, just to echo that, like the Cuban Revolution has always been closely in solidarity with like Black liberation movements around the world, like the Pan-Africanist movement, like you alluded to with Angola, but in the US as well. And like one of the effects of the blockade has been like this intentional effort of sabotage between like Black American and like Cuban relations. For instance, and the big one in my mind is like after Hurricane Katrina, Cuba and Venezuela both were like had doctors at the airport prepped and ready to go to like rescue people, and the US government, George Bush, like denied it from both those countries. And those would have been like Cuba was sending 1,500, and I think Venezuela was sending another several hundred. So that would have been thousands of doctors that instead the US decided to pursue like a path of sending thousands of National Guards and commit ethnic cleansing of the Black community in New Orleans. So just to highlight that as like a
yeah.
But yeah, we can definitely move to the action part, the protest too.
Yeah, please. I am really interested in learning about and for anyone watching as well, how they can also kind of get involved in that struggle. So I'm interested to hear more about that.
Awesome. So I guess I'll start with, while we were in Cuba, I think we heard a lot of calls from Cuba for unity between progressive and anti-imperialist forces within the US and the West as a whole. And Cuba has something we don't have, which is unity, because everyone is united in the revolution and working towards the revolution and in these national mass organizations of which the vast majority of the population is members of. And of course, there's lots of debate and disagreement within those groups, but everyone is still working together towards the same goal, and there are processes for that debate. But in the US, especially, our movement is very fractured. And so the NNOC is a coalition. That's really something we're trying to move away from and to build more unity among groups, even groups that might not be explicitly socialist or communist, but can still get around the cause of normalizing relations with Cuba and lifting the blockade. So while we were in Cuba, like I said, there were many other delegations there, such as the labor delegation with U.S. Hands Off Cuba and the Amazon Labor Union and Chris Smalls. There was also a huge delegation of 150 young people with the International People's Assembly and the People's Forum. And we met with those groups and we talked about building unity against the blockade. And specifically, the NNOC is leading this campaign to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And this is a measure that was first taken by Ronald Reagan, who called Cuba a terrorist for supporting national liberation struggles in Africa and Latin America. And then Obama took Cuba off the list and admitted there was zero evidence or justification for keeping Cuba on the list. And then Trump added Cuba back on January 11th, 2021, 4 days after the Capitol insurrection, just like a week before his term ended, kind of to set Biden up to be in this position that he's in right now, where he's getting pressure from the right and the left to either take Cuba off the list or keep Cuba on. And so we're trying to build public pressure on Biden to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And there's also an act in Congress right now by some right-wing Miami Republicans to codify into law Cuba's designation as a terrorist state. But what this designation does is, even though it's, it's only a list that's upheld and maintained by the US, because of the immense power the US has over the international financial system, it has really severe impacts on the Cuban economy and on Cuba's ability to get loans, to participate in international trade. It's also impacted the ability of US people to send donations or to send money to their family in Cuba. And also prevented, some universities and cultural institutions from having exchanges with Cuba. So our goal is to end the entire blockade, but we're focusing on the state sponsors of terrorism list, since it's something Biden could change with the stroke of his pen. And we've been running this campaign for the entire year on many different terrains, because we know we can't just be struggling in the halls of Congress. We also have to be on the streets and educating our communities and doing so many different forms of protest and action to fight for Cuba. But on June 25th, we're organizing a big protest at the White House to take Cuba off the list, to call for an end to all US sanctions, to say that Cuba is not a terrorist state, and that actually we should call for an end to US terrorism against Cuba. So if folks are interested in joining the protest or in organizing one locally in your city, if you can't come to DC, there are also going to be protests all over Canada, in Jamaica, and other parts of the world. So our website is nnoc.org, and there's lots of information about the entire campaign there. And I'd also want to pass it over to Josh, because he's part of the Black Alliance for Peace, which has also just launched this campaign for a zone of peace in the Americas, which is also a really exciting prospect that we can use to mobilize US people, to get them to realize how intertwined our destinies are with Cuba and with all of the Americas, to be fighting against imperialism.
Yeah, thank you, Kala. And just to say on moving towards the state-sponsored or designated state-sponsored terrorism list, recently, I think even yesterday it was, DC City Council passed a measure urging President Biden to take Cuba off the state-sponsored for terrorism list. So there is movement happening towards this issue. Yeah. But yeah, so one part, but also, yeah, Black Alliance for Peace has launched its Zone of Peace campaign. The Zone of Peace is rejecting US imperialism out of across the Americas. Zone of Peace is it's currently a state, or earlier, prior to the people-centered Zone of Peace campaign, it was a state-sponsored initiative done by countries across Latin America who are uniting around issues that obviously all tie back to US imperialism, such as illegal immigration, violence between the cartels and civilians, military and police brutality, So the idea of Black Alliance for Peace's Zone of Peace campaign is to really, as Kala said, unite forces across the Americas against our shared enemy, which is U.S. imperialism specifically, and U.S. militarization, which has made the whole region much less safe. So we have 6 sort of core demands related to that, and I urge everyone who hasn't to go to blackallianceforpeace.com, where you can read it, your organization, if it's in the Americas or anywhere, if you're interested in advancing the work of anti-U.S. militarization, of rejecting U.S. imperialism. You can just learn more about it there. But our 6 core demands that we're uniting with everyone around are dismantling SOUTHCOM, the U.S. Southern Command, which has 67 U.S. military bases in the region, ending U.S. NATO military exercises, disbanding U.S.-sponsored state terrorist training facilities. That includes the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, and terminating U.S. as well as foreign training of police forces. We also are opposing military intervention into Haiti, returning our 5th goal is to return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba, return Guantanamo back to the land that it belongs to, and acknowledging that sanctions are war and calling for an end to illegal sanctions that the U.S. is practicing, not only against Cuba, but against Venezuela, against Iran, against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, among others. So that's a little bit about the campaign. But I know there was, I think there's one other thing we wanted to touch on, just if we have another second.
Yeah, please.
So one of the things that I think we only covered very lightly was the treatment of U.S. activists by TSA and Border Patrol upon return to the United States. I know Kyle's going to be able to pick up with the details for me after this, but like many of our comrades from both our National Network on Cuba delegation, but also on the People's Forum, the International People's Assembly delegation, upon returning to the United States, were harassed at the border, were threatened with jail time by TSA agents, were detained for hours without reason or without due cause, all for going on a perfectly legal, by the US's own regulation, like a perfectly legal trip to Cuba. So I think we just want to keep highlighting that it's the US that is ironically treating its young people who care about its future like the worst. The US government is the one who is repressing us. It revoked the TSA pre-check or the global entry status of one of the members of our delegation, along with another member getting their electronics seized just indefinitely. So
yeah.
So but I can pass it to Kala to describe that a little more.
Yeah. Well, as always, all these accusations that the U.S. hurls at other countries are always projection each and every time. And this is another one of those cases. We're talking about repressing the civilians, repressing people's freedom of travel and things like that.
Yep. It's all just a projection of what's actually the reality in the U.S. But I think Josh gave a great overview, and I guess the only thing I'd add is that this kind of harassment has been happening for decades, ever since the very first U.S. Solidarity Brigades to Cuba, where young people were followed, harassed, interrogated by the FBI, parents interrogated by the FBI, all their belongings taken. And it hasn't been at that level in recent years, but I think this year we saw a much higher level of detainments and interrogations, clearly politically targeted questions than we have in past years. And that's a demonstration of how strong this solidarity movement is becoming and how important it is that we're traveling to Cuba and doing this kind of work. And our trip was completely licensed, completely legal. So it's important that we reaffirm our right to travel to Cuba and that we don't let this attempt to scare or intimidate us out of traveling to Cuba actually get to us, because solidarity can never be blockaded. And the US blockade is fundamentally undemocratic. It is being upheld against the democratic will of the US people, which a majority of which are fundamentally and consistently opposed to the blockade, and also against the democratic will of the entire world, which votes against the blockade every year in the United Nations, except the US and Israel, of course, which is illegally blockading and bombing Gaza. But I think Cuba shows us a better world is not just possible in the future, that it already exists. And we felt this really incredible hope while we were in Cuba, with people who are working towards the revolution every day, that I think is kind of suffocated when we get back to the belly of the beast. But it's really important that we don't lose that. And I genuinely felt this hope that we can end the blockade within our lifetimes when we were in Cuba. And I don't want that feeling to slip away, because it is absolutely possible if we continue to organize and if we get past our internal divisions and actually unite around fighting this monster that is US imperialism.
Yeah, and I wanted to just back up for just a moment to touch on something that where you're talking about, the idea that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, which is just so preposterous as an accusation coming from the United States. And you go back to like the Obama foreign policy, which was barbaric and a horrific imperialist foreign policy. But they did accomplish a few things which were actually genuinely like significant accomplishments that I think were worthy of respect, which was the Iran deal, helping to normalize relations with Iran, and also normalizing relations with Cuba and taking them off that list, which of course, both of those things Trump immediately undid as soon as he was in office, or just as he was leaving office, as you pointed out, which also takes this whole idea that Trump is some kind of an anti-imperialist, shows how absurd that notion is in the first place as well. But that was one of the arguments, though, with when Biden was running against Trump, was like, well, I'm Biden's foreign policy will probably be imperialist and terrible as well, but at the very least, perhaps he'll just go back to those Obama era policies when it comes to Cuba and Iran, which would be two positive things, and he's failed to do both of those things, which I think should show you, what the priorities of this kind of Democratic Party establishment is. And the differences between the two parties, which are negligible, really, even though there are differences. And yeah, I think that's really important. And just the way that like the Democratic Party especially is so beholden to this idea that they can compete in Florida as long as they don't anger these extreme reactionary groups of like Cuban expats and other Latin American expats who have deliberately been kind of cultivated because of their anti-communist views and their like conservative views. And I remember when Bernie Sanders was like possibly on his way to winning the Democratic Party nomination after Nevada, when it looked like that was almost inevitable, that was the whole, I'll never forget this, that was the whole news cycle for like 2 weeks, was Bernie Sanders in the 80s said positive things about Cuban literacy programs. And the idea that it was so unthinkable that you could have this Democratic candidate who had said positive things about literacy in Cuba or Castro, because then you're going to turn off these reactionary groups of Latin American immigrants in Florida, who of course did not vote for Joe Biden either. And how completely silly that entire strategy is, that they must continue to support the blockade. They can never say anything positive about the Cuban Revolution, at the risk of alienating these like extremely reactionary groups of immigrants in Florida. It's so silly, this notion that they're still so beholden to.
Yeah, so silly. Just to add on one thing, and then Josh, I'll let you hop in. But it's important to know, like, of course, Obama's policy towards Cuba was still attempts at regime change. It was just with different tactics, because clearly the blockade had not been working. But normalizing relations between the US and Cuba had massive positive impacts for both countries. And Biden is simply, being a coward. And I want to point out the main reason that they've given for, not changing the state sponsor of terrorism designation is because they don't want to piss off Bob Menendez, who is basically solely determining Biden's Cuba policy. And Biden needs Menendez to get appointments through the Senate. So he does want to make him angry, even though most US people support taking Cuba off the list. And also there's a huge movement of Cuban Americans who are against the blockade. And so these right-wing fascists don't represent all Cuban Americans. They're just an extreme and very loud and well-funded minority, I'd say.
Yeah, and I was just going to say exactly that point about them being a well-funded minority that's given a giant platform. You said like they're as opposed to being like a real voter base with like issues, it is like a purposely cultivated like anti-communist movement that emerges entirely from United States funding. There's this quote, Kala said like the latter half of it, which was like from the CIA Director General or Secretary General, I don't know their title, but in 1959, saying that like the blockade had to, like, it would only be effective if they could make Cubans so desperate that they would be angry at something. And the reason that they had to do that was because there was no opposition to the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution was so widely supported that the only way that the US could fight against it was by blockade, like creating a situation of inescapable poverty unless you get funded by the US to be an anti-communist terrorist. So like just the nature of the controlled opposition on this issue. So, you know, I don't want to give them an out for saying, oh, they're fighting for a voter base or something. They're fighting to impose capitalism on Cuba because it's what like their corporate funders want.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to focus on that and not give them too much credit there. So I appreciate that. And I think that's a good place to leave it. Kala and Joshua, I mean, there's plenty more we could talk about. We've been going on an hour here. You're both welcome to come back on the show anytime. It was really fantastic to talk to you both. I really appreciate the work